All right. Welcome everybody to our first lecture here today at the Art Deco Museum. As part of our great Art Deco Weekend Festival, this is the final day of the festival, so we hope that you all will enjoy all the different programs that are going on this morning. Also in the afternoon, we have a great music lineup and we jazz exchange at 12th Street, so please join us there. And we are very lucky today. By the way, I'm Hernando D'Escalante, I'm the Executive Director of Miami Design and Reservation, and we are the organization that produces Art Deco Weekend. We also fight year-round to preserve, promote, and protect all that is special here within our Art Deco district. And right now, we're in a very challenging time in the state where a lot of that is up on ground. So we need to make sure that we're not lecturing and educating about all of this history so that it does not get erased. So we are very excited today to be joined by one of our Miami Beach commissioners, Tanya Bott, who also was on the board of directors of Miami Design Investigation for many years. So please join me in welcoming our newly elected Commissioner, Tanya Bott.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for getting up relatively early, I guess early by South Beach Standard Time. To join us for we're going to get the last day of a fantastic 47th annual, is that what an amazing weekend here in Miami Beach. So thank you for that. I have the honor of being a friend and collaborator with Stuart Reed for a number of years. I can't even remember how we first met, but it goes back at least to historic preservation conversations, because we served on, we worked in advocacy and protecting this organization, not just the buildings that the organization tries to protect, but protecting the organization some years ago. And since then, we've become friends and we served on board together. We've played together. Stuart is now also on the Historic Preservation Board for the City of Miami Beach. It's a land use board, and everything that happens in the city, or a lot of things that happen in the city, have to go through that board. In addition, Stuart is an attorney that we here. He's lived here on and off since 1997 and lives here currently. He owned his first solo office in the Miami Beach Historic City Hall, actually. So this is a long-standing love affair with Miami Beach and its history. He has worked from 1992. Stuart had worked for the Miami-Dade County Department of Environmental Resources Management as pollution control inspector. And through some of the work that he's done here in that capacity and exploring around on the water, Stuart discovered this sort of interesting vantage point about South Florida history that doesn't get discussed very often. And I don't want to steal his thunder, but it is something we're talking about, the beautiful built environment of recent past. But Stuart is going to take us on a journey that goes far beyond that. And again, I don't want to steal his thunder, so I'll stop right there and turn it over to him. Thank you, Stuart.
Tanya, Commissioner Bott, Daniel, Mr. Diallo, and everybody who came today. All of this is turned off. Yeah, first I want to thank MDPL for giving me the opportunity to present this story of Hernando D'Escalante Fontaneda. Also like to thank my friend Commissioner Bott for giving me an introduction. It was a surprise and it's an honor, and also an honor that friends who I've invited, you've showed up. Thank you very much. It means a lot to me. I went to the first lecture for this Art Deco weekend, which was about historic preservation advocacy. And at the end of the presentation, when people were able to ask questions, and then the presenters were able to ask questions, and we're going to perhaps have time at the end of this presentation where if you want to ask questions, and likewise, she asked, well, what do you think historic preservation means? And of course, the first thing that came to my mind, welcome, is preserving the built environment, preserving historic neighborhoods, but then it occurred to me historic preservation is also about preserving memories, remembering the people that came before us. Even if the physical evidence of the presence here has long gone. Hernando D'Escalante Fontaneda is somebody, I'm not surprised if you never heard his name. I grew up here. I never heard of him. I went to high school here. I went to law school in Florida. I've traveled around the state. I first heard about him when I went to a lecture at the Wolfsonian Museum around 2006 that Bob Carr, the state's chief archaeologist, was giving at that time about all the discoveries at the Miami Circle, what they were uncovering from the Tequesta tribe, the tribe that preceded Spanish settlement in Florida, and what we were learning about their way of life. I think that might be my cue to go ahead. And this is the actual memoir. So let me go back. So, and he mentioned during his lecture that everything that we know pretty much about the natives who lived here before the Spanish settled in Florida came from the memoir of a guy. He didn't even mention the name. I had to Google it to find it out. He says a guy who was shipwrecked in Florida at 13 years old. He was a slave of the Calusa for 17 years. And then he became an interpreter for the first Spanish governor of Florida, Pedro Menendez Davalos. And then when he was rescued, he became his interpreter. And Bob Carr said the reason why they kept him alive is they liked his singing. Like, what a story. I Googled it, and I put out the website here for all of you, if you haven't seen it already, where you can look at the translation. I'm going to be reading from the translation, where you can read Fontaneda's memoir. In one of the translations, that's going to be one of the issues today, that there are several translations. They're not all the same. There are several transcriptions. They're not all the same. So sometimes you have to use your imagination and your best judgment to figure out really what was going on in his life. And so I looked for it, and I found the English translation. I did not at first, of course, come across this. Did I pass this around yet?
Okay, good. If you want to look at it, here's more copies.
The lengthier, for those of you who came later, the lengthier document is Escalante Fontaneda's memoir, and I highlighted portions of it I'm going to be discussing. The shorter document is the appointment of Ponce de Leon as the adelantado, the governor supreme of Florida. And I might, well, if we have time, we'll speak about that as well. I think it's amazing how advanced lawyers were at that time. That was a contract that you'd expect from a high-priced law firm at this time, but it was a contract of discovery. It was very interesting. So this is this is his signature. Something and I learned so much preparing for this presentation. That's another reason why I'm grateful for this opportunity. I heard about this from the lecture from Bob Carr about the Tequesta. And I found the memoir that you see. I went out and learned as much as I could about the times. I read Columbus's 4 voyages. Did you know he didn't only come here and discover? He went back and then came back and forth 4 times and went all around the Caribbean. And there were all sorts of adventures and misadventures and discoveries and politics that followed him. And so this is also sort of like a book review lecture today. It's so that if you are taking interest in this subject, you know how rich it is and where you can get information. The Conquest of New Spain, which was Mexico, by Bernal Diaz, about Hernan Cortez. This is an odd name, the Florida of the Inca. He called himself the Inca because his mother was Indian native from Cartagena, where actually Hernando D'Escalante was from, and his father was a Spaniard. And he interviewed soldiers who survived the De Soto army's entrance into Florida, and he wrote about this. But he said, and I found it interesting, I read the preface last night, and he said And he interviewed these people, but he put the work aside for like 20 years. And now he's writing the book because otherwise the whole history would be lost. And I kind of relate. Like my work had been sitting, interest, until MDPL gave me this opportunity. And I've since then come across a brand new book, which was brand new by relatively, Discovering Florida, which actually has the actual documents from these expeditions and from Fontaneda himself, and the translations, and a scholar's input. And we'll get back into that. And then the last adventure that I really highly recommend, Alvaro Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. Anybody heard of him? Narvaez was one, you see, this is fascinating, and I'm jumping around, and I meant to talk about this later on in the lecture, but I guess I'm just getting it out right now. But you know, when Columbus came to the New World, pretty much everywhere they landed, they controlled with very little difficulty. Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, then Cuba and the Mexico, South America, they won. But Florida, it took 4 armies before, and about more than 50 years. Ponce de Leon first came to Florida in 1513. They chased him away. And we'll get into that too. It's very interesting. Then he came back in 1521 and was killed. Then Narvaez, and the only one to survive was this Cabeza de, among the survivors, Cabeza de Vaca. Actually, they built rafts where they had a sail from like around the Big Bend area up by Tallahassee of Florida. And they landed in the coast of Texas, like around, let's start with a G. Galveston. I was going to say Gatlinburg. That's not right. Galveston. And he was a slave as well and survived. He wrote what he ate. But then at some point, he said he made the sign of a cross over somebody and they were healed and he got a reputation. And in his narrative, he said that as he was walking from village to village, sometimes there were thousands of people waiting for him. And then until he finally came upon a Spanish settlement in New Spain in Mexico. So that's another amazing story. But today we're talking about this guy, Hernando D'Escalante Fontaneda. And that's the first and last page in his signature. Something I learned when I looked at this, I think this is on the other side of the page. This is just a digital copy that a professor sent to me, but it looks, when you look really close, you have it around there too, looks like the sign of a hand or something. So another thing to look into, I may have to take a trip one day to Spain to go to their archive for the Council of Indies to look at these original documents, because as you see, that a lot of the digital copies, you can see the other side of the page. It's really messy. It's hard to read, even if you're able to read this weird script. So this is what I first read, was Buckingham Smith's translation. We'll maybe talk about him at the end. Everybody's story, there's so many connections. That's one of the themes of this lecture today, is how everything is interconnected. There's another translation from Henri Tourneau-Companys. He was a French diplomat, and there are differences. And this is the book that I recently came across from Professor John Worth, who's a professor of anthropology at the University of West Florida in Pensacola, who actually sent me the images of the memoir for this lecture. Responded to my email immediately. Just a few weeks ago, my daughter, here's another book recommendation. It has nothing to do with Fontaneda. 5 People You Meet in Heaven. Anyone heard of this? Mitch Albom. So there was a quote in that about how everybody's life is interconnected. I looked it up, and this is actually the sequel to the next person you meet in heaven. But that our lives all connect like threads on a loom, interwoven in ways we never realized. That's, I think, a big common theme. And when you look into this story, that all of the translators, all of the professors, all of the historical figures, nobody, this story wouldn't be around. people wouldn't have survived. Let's get into it. Let's see what's the next. Okay, so my involvement in this story started in like the 90s, early 2000s. I kayaked around Biscayne Bay frequently. These pictures I took on a trip with two friends where we started in Miami Beach and we've kayaked for 8 days all around the entire circumference of Biscayne Bay. We went down to Key Biscayne, Key Largo, Elliott Key, and then back up around the Miami side. And I wondered frequently what life like here for the natives. They had all the fresh fish and seafood you could want. And if you read about fresh water supplies in Biscayne Bay before modern settlement, there's like around Coconut Grove, or Miami, something called the Punch Bowl, where fresh water just would come out. There were places where British sailors would drop casks, barrels into the bay and pull up fresh water because fresh water would bubble up from aquifers. So I was thinking they must have had a really great, easy life, except for hurricanes and mosquitoes. So, and then the lecture came from Bob Carr, and he talking about what they uncovered at the Miami Circle. And in preparation for this lecture today, I went to the Miami History Museum, another recommendation for you today. And they have an exhibit with things that they got at the Miami Circle. I'm only showing a few of these things because there's so many slides that we're going to show today, but something that fascinated me was like the trade network, that they found things on the Miami River from Mexico, from looks like maybe up around, southeastern Missouri. There was a trade network, and it showed shark teeth and vertebra from stingrays and things they used as tools. Definitely worth a visit. I think I remember what the next slide is. Oh, so he said everything we know, Bob Carr, comes from the memoir of from the natives who were here before the Spaniards. Pretty much everything we know comes from his memoir. Well, in this memoir, he mentions the word Miami in writing for the first time. And we'll go back into more detail too, because it raises more questions. He says, La Laguna de Miami, llámase Laguna de Miami porque es muy grande. They call it the Laguna, the Lake of Miami, because it's very big. We'll leave it at that for right now. Just for you to know, Okeechobee means big waters, right? But Okeechobee is a Seminole word. The Seminoles came to Florida after all these Spanish Indians, the Tequesta, the Calusa, the Timucuan, the other tribes we're going to speak about. They died off, or they left after Spain left Florida and it was turned over to England. A lot of the Indians remaining here just left with the Spanish because they were afraid of the English and their allies, the Creeks, that came in and became the Seminoles and the Miccosukes. But Miami apparently means the same thing as Okeechobee, although he doesn't mention waters. He just says it's big. Remember that. Okay, so this professor who sent me that the actual copy of the memoirs, he also sent me this. These are other things that he found when he was looking in the archives in Spain. These are other things that they were able to attribute to Fontaneda because they have the same handwriting. And here he's just listing the different tribes and the chiefs and all the sub-chiefs. So they had, if you're interested, when we're done here, I can share copies of this with you and how to find these things. And this is also from the Miami History Museum. And this is a translation of one of the extra documents beyond the memoir. This is a picture of what it may have looked like along the Miami River. This would have been the circle itself. They're putting holes in it. Guys going out to sea, fishing, little fish traps there. And then a quote here that I'm going to read But here's the funny thing. I told you the translations sometimes they vary, so you don't always know what's accurate or not. This translation came from an article that Professor John Worth published in '95 that I came across when I first took an interest in it. But in his book, the translation isn't exactly the same. Like here they talk about when a whale is diving, and here he says when the whale is coming up. It sounds more accurate to me. I'll read from the translation in the book. This is about the Tequestas tribe that lived in Miami. So here's the second. I'm going to go in. There's 2 paragraphs. The title of this paragraph is "The Indians of Tequesta," the ones who lived in Miami and around the Bay, which is another province from the Martyrs through the Keys. We're going to go into that more too, up to Canaveral. It says, "And in the winter, all the canoes go to the sea. And among all these Indians, there comes forth one Indian who's sent with 3 stakes at his waist, and he throws a lasso around the neck of a whale. And while it's coming up, he places a stake in one of the air holes. And thus it's tied up. He does not lose it because he goes on top of it. And upon killing it as they do, they run it aground on the sand. And the first thing they do is open up the head and remove 2 bones that it has in the skull. And they place these bones in this box where they place their dead, and they worship this." That's the second paragraph. Here's the first. "When a cacique," which is the way you say chief in the natives' language, when a cacique or noble dies, this is the Tequestas, they cut him up and remove the large bones of the body, and they bury the small bones with the body. And in the house of the cacique, they place a large chest, and in this chest they enclose the large bones. And all the town comes there to worship these bones, which they have as their gods." And then they put the whale bones into the box with sheep. So when I came across these things, I'm like, how come nobody knows this guy's story? And other things that you'll see. So let me advance. So Escalante wrote that was about the Tequestas burial practices for the cacique and catching whales. I mean, did you even know, I guess, were there whales living off of South Florida? That answers the question. And we know nowadays, every now and then we hear about whales coming up ashore in Palm Beach County, and we hear about the right whales that are coming down as far down as Palm Beach County, which are very large baleen whales, but there are all kinds of whales. So those were the burial practices for the Tequesta chief. Fontaneda, captive of the Calusa tribe, which was primarily on the West Coast. And he wrote that he knew the languages of 4 of the tribes. Apparently the Tequesta as well as the Calusa Tocobaga. He said he didn't know the languages of the Ice and the Jaga because he never lived with them. He spoke about Miami, but this is a photograph from the History Museum on their exhibit about the Miami Circle. But he also wrote about the Appalachee, Ocala, Timucuan, which were up around the St. Augustine, where the first fort was built. So he traveled around, which was another question of mine. Why was this slave traveling around and learning all the languages? Maybe it had something to do with the fact that he was singing and what he was singing. And we'll get back to, that's why I brought my speakers today. I'm going to play some songs maybe that he was singing. And so he was, and remember I told you that a lot of times now, the deeper I go into it, you find it never ends. And I guess that's like any subject. You can always go deeper and learn more. But I'm learning a lot of things that are just inconsistent. Like, I think it was Fontaneda himself that mentioned that the Calusa, they governed all the way up to Tampa. He mentions the word Tampa as well. Ocala, what is this up there? Cacema, Casema. Kissimmee maybe, right? So, but he wrote that the Tocobaga tribe, they governed from the inland, from a river off of the bay. Just to let you know. So so here's the burial practices of the Tocobaga. I have two more burial practices before we get into the memoir. Tocobaga and Calusa. Tocobaga says, when principal Caciques dies, they cut them up into pieces and cook them in some large jars and cook them 2 days until all the meat separates from the bones. And they take the bones and attach one bone with another until they reassemble the man as he was. And they place him in a house that they have as a temple while they finish assembling him. They fast for 4 days. And at the end of the 4 days, the entire town gathers. And they come forth with him in procession and bury him, showing great reverence. And then they say that all those who go in the procession gain indulgences. Okay, one more quickly, which is about Calusa. Then they call him Carlos, the chief. His name was Carlos. So the memorial of what happens among the Indians of the land itself, those of Carlos. First, they have as custom that each time a child of the chief dies, each resident sacrifices one of their sons or daughters who go in the company of the death of the child of the chief. If you feel like crying, I mean, that's sad, right? The second sacrifice is that when the male chief himself dies, or the female chief, they kill his or her own servants. And this is the second sacrifice. The third sacrifice is that they kill every year one captive Christian in order to feed the idol that they worship, which they say eats the eyes of humans, and they dance with the head each year, which they have as a custom. I think they mean the head of the captive that they killed. And the fourth sacrifice is that after the summer, there come some shamans in the figure of the devil with some horns on their heads, and they come howling like wolves, and many other different idols that shout like animals of the woods. And these idols are 4 months during which they never get any rest, night or day, running with great fury. What a thing to recount the great bestiality that they perform. These are words from some guy in the 16th century. But they were saying that maybe this was not included in his memoir because of how kind of grotesque it is, because he's going back to a country where they have the Inquisition. And if he was a witness or a participant in something like this, he wanted to show what a pious person they owed him money. We'll get into that too. They owed his family money. They owed all the interpreters money. May have been one of the reasons why he wrote the memorial and why there might be some amazing secret that's hidden in it that we'll talk about. So thanks to Daniel Seraldo, he said, hey, when you send me your slides, make sure not to have so much text because people can't read from the back. And what pictures from the 1500s. So I used AI imagery. He was shipwrecked when he was 13 years old. We don't know exactly where, but he was captured by the Calusa. Huh? Yeah. But he was 13. So, and plus he had just been in Havana. He might have gotten a shave and a good meal before going to, he was heading from Cartagena to Spain, he and his brother, to get an education. So actually, the Cartagena is where he was from. His parents were his father was a conquistador, that's for sure, in Peru. And they were two of the original settlers of the new colony in Cartagena in 1533. Fontaneda was born in 1536. We know that because he said he was shipwrecked when he was 13. And we know he was, and that he was a slave until he was 30. He said 17 years. And Pedro Menendez wrote about him in a letter in 1566, using him as a translator. So I just did the math. So he was born in Cartagena. His parents were, this is a sea route of the treasure ships. So here they are sending the treasures to Spain. There was a law that 1/5 of all the gold belonged to the monarchy, the Quinto. So he was traveling with people, the king's gold, whatever. They stopped in Havana. Who knows where he was shipwrecked? And then the rest of the story takes place in Florida. It was the best map I could find of Puerto Rico, where Poncelia is from, Hispaniola, Cuba. This comes from Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. It's the best map, but part of, 1492, the year that Columbus discovered the Western Hemisphere, was the same year that Ferdinand and Isabella said, okay, if you're not a Christian, there's no home for you here anymore, and you have to convert or leave. And if you want to convert, well then, congratulations, welcome to the Inquisition. We'll find if you're a real Christian or not. So, turns out, a lot of the early settlers of the New World were Jews that they were converts, which they called conversos, or secret Jews. So a big percentage, and we'll go back into that later too. I want to give credit where it's due. I found this online. This is not one of my AI images. This is from the Marco chapter of the Collier County Historical Society about Calusa Indians. When I'm reading the memoir, you'll see he writes them almost all of their wealth comes from the sea, that they have no other riches really than what comes from the sea. The sluices where they directed where the fish would go. So these are represented the Calusas. There's a representation of the Calusa Chief's Lodge on Mound Key, which is in Estero Bay. Mound Key is an archaeological site you can go to now. And Escalante or some other person wrote that you could fit 2,000 people in there. That's why I think that's a fair representation. And that's at the Museum of Natural History in Gainesville by Merrill Clark. And if we have time, I'm going to read the scene where Pedro Menendez has like his first party with Carlos, the chief. It's amazing nobody knows these things, but let's keep going. Pedro Menendez is a statue outside of City Hall in St. Augustine. That's from some encyclopedia from the 1700s. AI again. Cartagena, Havana, shipwrecked in Florida, and the natives. Okay, pre-Columbian Florida village was my AI prompt. Florida Indians, Florida natives dancing on the beach was my prompt. Okay, the slaves with their oysters. So, I'll go back. I guess that they're over there. That's where the natives are in AI imagination. So, but, there were many slaves besides him. So then I made this, I asked AI for a natural shoreline undeveloped in Florida, so I would have something pretty but not too distracting as I read you Fontaneda's memorial in his own words. Just because I skipped over this. From that professor, he says the well-known relation of Hernando D'Escalante Fontaneda has correctly been described as a document that should share the top rank of Florida source records. It constitutes one of the earliest descriptions of the Indians of Florida and is rich in ethnographic detail. And another professor, he wrote, why do we not know about it? This could be one of the main reasons. Fontaneda's original text is often difficult to follow, lacking flow and replete with repetitions. While historians would accept such difficulties, the public at large may be less accommodating. When I first came across the translation, that's at the link I gave to you, I probably had to read it 5 times. I knew I read something important, but he just jumps around. Like first there's the title, The Memoir of the Things, the Shore, and the Indians of Florida, to describe which none of the many persons who have coasted that country know how to describe it. I think that's a fair description though, but certainly you got to read it a couple times. Then he talks about the geography of the Florida Keys, who they eat, the clothes they wear, the plants that grow there. That's why I call it Florida's first travelogue. It's not the first written document. Most of the other earlier documents were pretty much accounts of their adventures, their attempts to conquest and their failures. But here, his document is intended so that the Spanish kingdom would know what they're dealing with and who they're dealing with. What are the tribes? Who leads the tribes? Where do they live? What do they eat? And every now and then he throws in some personal observations and stories to knock some people down or build himself up, but I'm sure it was well deserved. So let me read some of this. He starts off talking about the martyrs, the Florida Keys. And so it's kind of thought he might have been shipwrecked there. The Calusa tribe did have authority over the Keys, but the other tribes paid tribute to the Calusa. So he could have been shipwrecked elsewhere. He said there are other islands near the mainland that stretch west-east called the Martyrs for the reason that many men have suffered on them, and also because certain rocks rise there from the distance, which look like men in distress. Indians are on these islands who are of large size. The women are well proportioned and have good countenances. You see, they're good looking. On these islands, there are 2 Indian towns in one of them, the town is called Guadagumbe, which the other map shows like Key West, which in Spanish is Pueblo de Llanto, the town of weeping. The name of the other little town, Cuchiaga, means the place where there has been suffering. A good thing that the Keys Chamber of Commerce changed, they don't call it the place of suffering. These Indians have no gold, less silver, and less clothing. They go naked except some breechcloths woven of palm with which the men cover themselves. The women do the like. Certain grass that grows on trees. The grass looks like wool, although it is different from it. The common food is fish, turtle, and snails, and tuna and whale, which is according to what I saw while I was among these Indians. Some eat sea wolves. It's a sea wolf. We'll get back to it. I was thinking maybe it's a manatee. Some eat sea wolves. The other guy, the French translation I wrote, said it was a wolffish. But not all of them, because there's a distinction between the higher and the lower classes, but the principal person eats them. They also eat lobster, chapin. You see, he really goes through it. On these islands are many deer and certain animal that looks like a fox, yet it's not. I'm thinking it's a raccoon. It's fat and good to eat. Other islands are very large bears, and the islands run from west to east, and the land of Florida passes eastward towards these islands, and that must be the reason of bears being on them, for the mainland is near. He says people can't believe all the deer that's on them. We know about the Florida, the key deer. He talks about a wood, palo para muchas cosas, which lignum vitae. In that period of time, lignum vitae was a very important wood. It's very dense. It would sink. It wouldn't rot. It was used for ship rudders, I think. So he talks now more about navigation. I'm going to skip through some of it, otherwise I'll never get done. And he even says himself a few times, I'm going to leave off there, otherwise I'll never get done. Like when he's talking about, here are all I can't tell you more about all the fruits and flowers, or else I'm never going to finish. He talks about the islands of Tortuga. He says the animal there is the size of a shield, the flesh as a cow. It's like all kinds of meat, but it's fish. Then he says about the territory of Carlos, the Calusa, where he was a slave. They are masters of a large district of country, as far as a town they call Guacata on the Lake of Miami, which is called Lake of Miami because it's very large. You're still wondering why. Now the Tequestas toured, and I'll talk about them because here we are. We're in Tequesta territory in Miami on Biscayne Bay, toward the north of the Martyrs and near a place of the Indians called Tequesta, situated on the bank of a river, which extends into the country the distance of 15 leagues, the Miami River, and issues from another lake of fresh water, which is said by some Indians who have traversed it more than I to be an arm of the Lake of Miami. That's why it was called the Miami River, because they thought it went all the way up to the Lake Miami. That's why Miami is called the name now, not because the site was Miami, not because the tribes were Miami, but because they thought the river went all the way up to Lake Miami. On this lake, which is in the midst of the country, are many towns of 30 to 40 inhabitants each, and as many more places there in which people are not so numerous. He talks about the bread they eat, the fish. They have eels that are as thick as human thighs. talks that the people walk around naked. Then he says, okay, about Auditor Lucas Vasquez, that they were searching for gold because everybody's talking about what do they have, what do they don't have. And he makes sure to mention they don't have gold, they don't have silver, they're all poor, they only get what they get by the sea. But he says Vasquez went up to Santa Elena, which was north of St. Augustine, or what they called the Fort San Mateo, and went up the river there, which is modern day like Charleston, South Carolina. But they didn't find gold there either. He says they have a lot of pearls, and they eat oysters, catfish. And now we're going to talk about something you've heard of, the Fountain of Youth. Ponce de Leon apparently went searching for a fountain of youth, right? He calls it the Jordan River from the Bible. More questions. It says the Jordan that is talked of is a superstition of the Indians of Cuba, which they hold to because it is their creed, not because there is such a river. Juan Ponce de Leon, giving heed to the tales of the Indians of Cuba and Santo Domingo, went to Florida in search of the River Jordan, that he might have some enterprise on foot, or that he might earn greater fame than he already possessed and close his life, which is the most probable supposition, or if not for these objects or purposes, then that he might become young from bathing in such a stream. This thought was of itself proof that all must have been a fiction that was told by the Indians of Cuba and its whole neighborhood, who, to satisfy their traditions, say that the Jordan was in Florida, to which at least I can say that while I was a captive there, I bathed in many streams, but to my misfortune, I never came upon the river. Anciently, many Indians from Cuba entered the ports of the province of Carlos in search of it, and farther of King Carlos, whose name Sequen. He stopped the persons and made a settlement of them, the descendants of whom remain to this day. So there were Cuban Indians living among the Calusa. They were there before Ponce de Leon got there. Remember that. Maybe that's why the Spaniards had a much harder time in Florida, because other places no one knew what was coming, but the Indians in Florida knew what was coming their way from the Cubans who came over here. And so the same purpose that those who left their country came in quest of the River Jordan, the kings and caciques of Florida, okay, they took the information and sought after, as though they had been a more polite people, that they might see what river that could be doing such a good thing, even to the turning of aged men and women back to their youth. So earnestly did they engage in the pursuit that there remained not a river nor a brook in all Florida, not even lakes and ponds, in which they did not bathe. And to this day, they persist in seeking that water and are never satisfied. In the attainment of the promises of their faith, those of Cuba determined, for such was their vow, to venture their lives on that sea, and it ended in all that numerous people who went over to Carlos forming a settlement. But to this day, youth and age find alike that they are mocked, and many have destroyed themselves. It is cause for merriment, I guess, to mock, like stand-up comedians, that Juan Ponce de Leon went to Florida to find the River Jordan. Then he talks about the Appalachians, which were way north in Florida. Again, why was he traveling so much, the slave? Talk about what did they wear? Talks about Carlos and his successors. Here he writes a little bit about himself. No one knows this country as well as I know it, who write this. For I was a captive among its inhabitants from a child the age of 13 years until I was 30 years old. I speak 4 languages, but not the language of Isinjaga, which is a country I never traveled into. The Isinjaga, again, are from like Palm Beach up to Canaveral. Says, I only wish to say of Carlos, it's a large country, it's rich in pearls, possesses little gold. The Indians are numerous, they're great warriors. They're clothed in skins, some of them, and they're great painters. Whatever they see, they paint. They're called Kanagokola, which means a people without respect, skillful with the bow. And here's his opinion: but with the good arms of the Spaniards will overcome them. Good crossbows, firelocks and shields, swords broad and sharp, good horses and escopetas, shotguns, with one or two persons who understand their ways, the interpreters being true and trustworthy. In fact, if I could find it quick, skip back where he pretty much advises that I think we should just stick them all on ships and scatter them around the Caribbean, because we're never going to make peace with these people. We're never going to be able to turn them into Christians. In fact, one of the books that I mentioned, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, written by Bartolomé de las Casas, he mentions the bad treatment that all of the Indians got, and from his book there were new laws that they couldn't mistreat them. They had a genocide, basically. So Menendez wanted to convert them. He tried to make peace with them, but by 1573, which was about 2 years before Fontaneda wrote his memoir, the governor of Florida, Menendez, was already writing to Spain for permission to go to war with the Florida Indians. And this is one of the reasons why he came to Southwest Florida, is because he already had his fort up in northeastern Florida, St. Augustine area, but they had all these Christian captives by the Calusa. And let me return to that too. He tells a story of a guy who he thwarted a plot against Pedro Menendez and wrote that Menendez wouldn't have died of old age in Santander. He would have died that day and there if it wasn't for me. He said that when Christians were found and shipwrecked, and that was one of the basis for that they wanted to settle in Florida too. So many ships carrying that Spanish gold were shipwrecked in Florida. In fact, the Indians were rich, but because of all the shipwrecks, they had a lot of gold. They had a lot of from that washed up, but they also had a lot of captives. So he was saying how important it is for these people to establish safe havens for them. And in fact, when St. Augustine, or San Mateo at the time, just the fort had been built, people knew when they were shipwrecked, walk north, because that's where you can find safety, which was also the reason why in modern times they had the houses of refuge up and down the Florida coastline for shipwreck survivors. And he wrote, it was a consolation, though a sad one, for those who were lost after us to find on the shore Christian companions who could share their language and help to understand those brutes. Many Spaniards have saved their lives by finding themselves with Christian companions there. For the natives who took them would order them to dance and sing. And as they did not understand, and the Indians themselves are very mean, they thought the Christians were rebellious and unwilling to do so, and they would kill them and report to the cacique that for their meanness and rebelliousness, they had been slain because they wouldn't do what they were told. And then one day, he said, I, a mulatto, and 2 other Spaniards, recently made captors, being present, the cacique, Carlos, in conversation with all his royal house and great chiefs, he said to me, because I was the most Ladino, which he says better acquainted with the language than anyone. I hope I have enough time to go into oh, I do. That's very important. He says, when we tell these people to dance and sing and do other things, why don't they do it? He says, well, they just don't understand you. They just, and then he tested it out. He saw it was right. And then the chief commanded everybody, look, they don't understand you. Before you kill anybody, bring them to me first. So Escalante saved people's lives and it turned out, as the interpreter for Governor Menendez, he was a central figure being an interpreter with I mean, he had personal relationship already with Carlos, and Carlos gave Governor Menendez his sister as a wife to make peace between them. And so let me leave Fontaneda's memoir aside soon if I can. Yeah, he says that Florida's subjugation is befitting His Majesty. in order to protect people. Many people die there. The Indians are powerful archers. And I think we need to have forts, and you need to scatter everybody else. These are the different explorations in the New World. Came into Florida, 4 of them, and Ponce de Leon. So this is where, he says the comida ordinaria, the normal fish that I spoke to before, lobos marinos. Some people get to eat the sea wolves. Buckingham Smith's translation, sea wolves. And I like Buckingham Smith's translation compared to the other two. Turn out wolffish. John Worth, seals. He's right. 100%. Because I once slept on my cousin's sailboat in Marina del Rey in Los Angeles, and they sound like dogs. The barking, woof, 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 woof. And in fact, yes, this is the actual text where they talk about Marinos lobos. And these are Lobo Marino, but Foca. But guess what? There were never any sea lions in Florida, but there was the Caribbean monk seal, and it's extinct. There remain today Hawaiian monk seals. There may be some monk seals left in the Mediterranean. I read accounts that this Caribbean monk seal would cover islands in the Bahamas and the Keys. And because they didn't have any natural predators, they weren't afraid. And so, people would kill them for the oil. They would just boil them down for oil to light their lamps and stupid things. And for me, talking about imagination, all the things that spur my imagination from this story, Fontaneda, I would love to see a monk seal swimming around Biscayne Bay on the rocks at South Point Park. And then, again, he said, okay, so they kept me alive because they liked my singing. And so I understood the commands to sing. Oh, my speakers went off. I'll turn them right back on because they've been not in use. So most of the music that I found online from that period of time, medieval Spain, most of the medieval Spanish music is actually liturgical, things they would sing in church. Chants and instrumentals. But about 80 to 90% of the music that survived from that period is Sephardic romance music, Sephardic love songs. I'm hitting the wrong thing. I have this pointer.
So this is one of them. So in fact,
those who came in early, the first song I was playing was called El Cativo Ya Viene. So was he singing romance Ladino songs to Kesta Chief? The chief told him, I was the most Ladino of all these people. What does Ladino mean? It's the Judeo-Spanish language, but also it's come to mean, what does Buckingham Smith say? I was the most Ladino, better acquainted with the language. Maybe. I was the most deceitful of them all. John Worth. The chief was the most true to them all and asked me, who knows? So according to John Worth, the Ladino was talking about the chief himself. But then when you look at the actual language, go back, it looks like this is yo, he put up, because that's an E era, yo era. La Mas Ladino. It's in there, highlighted in the things that I gave to you. So I think he was talking about him. And then back to the word Miami, for example. Let me turn the music off. We know Okeechobee means big waters. Fact. They called it Lake Miami because it was so large. Okay. What are the things in common between Miami and Okeechobee? This is not anything accepted. It's just a thing in my mind. But the E on the end, Miami, Okeechobee, maybe that's the way to emphasize. It's big. How do you say Anybody here speak Hebrew? Know how to say water? In Mayim, okay? He was the most Ladino. It was called Miami on account of it was so large. Maybe he was playing a trick on us, okay? Because he also wrote that for all his years in service as an interpreter, he and the other guys weren't paid. And we know people wanted revenge, and maybe the other people weren't responding to the commands to sing because they maybe didn't have the repertoire like this kid did, growing up in maybe a secret Jewish household. Who know, and so one of the other scholars I have to recognize for today is Abraham Lavender. Anybody here remember Abraham Lavender? Passed away a couple of years ago. He was a professor at FIU of anthropology, and he had a specialization in the Sephardic Jewish dispersion. And I looked for the guy's name online for information, Hernando D'Escalante Fontaneda. Like, maybe that could give me some insight to his background. D'Escalante means somebody from Escalante, his father. Fontaneda, somebody from Fontaneda, his mother. So I asked the professor, was it common, like, for Jewish people to change their names to where they came from? Yes, it was. And in fact, 25% of all people in Latin America and the New World, according to him, he did like DNA studies, have Jewish DNA because, you know, they were escaping persecution. So it's just something to think of. I'm not saying Miami is a Hebrew word. It's possible, though. I mean, is it a coincidence? Because nobody knew the name of that tribe, these minor tribes along the lake, except for this particular guy. He wrote about it. Well, they don't spelling, you know, he wasn't good at spelling. No, Mayim's in Hebrew, so it doesn't even have a Y. That's just our transliteration. So let's see where So was he entertaining the Tequesta chief at the Miami Circle with songs and I don't know. So this is a scene also of undeveloped Florida so that I could read to you. Let's see how much time I have left. Oh, I only have a couple of minutes left. So if anybody wants to stick around afterwards, I can tell you about the scene where supposedly the brother-in-law of Pedro Menendez, who was one of the people who came with him to look for all the Christian captives held by Carlos in southwestern Florida. He wrote about the whole crazy story. And the first person who came out like on a canoe to greet them on their ship was Fontaneda. And he came back and he told them that Carlos was looking to kill them. And then this story, they somehow get Carlos aboard the boat with some people, but then they cut the anchors and they take him out to sea. And then Menendez tells him, if you don't release all these Christian captives, I'm going to kill you right here and now. But they weren't afraid because they had hundreds of Indians on the shore. But then the boat had cut loose. They made peace. And I have to read this. It's too good not to go over. He came to meet him at that large lodge I showed you that can accommodate up to 2,000 people. It says all the soldiers came up to the chief Carlos and the adelantado, the governor, went to eat with him carrying 200 arquebusiers. Those are the old rifles with they're wide at the end and they have to have a fuse already lit. They had 200 arquebusiers, a flag, 2 fifes, drummers, 3 trumpets, a harp and a guitar, a psalter, and a small dwarf, a great singer and dancer, whom he brought with him. This was the first meeting between the Governor Menendez and the Calusa. He brought a singing dwarf. And then he went into the room with only 20 gentlemen of the chief. And there were large windows. It was a good-sized room. There were 500 noble Indians and the Indian women below him. And then when the adelantado ascended to the room, the chief gave him the place that he had and withdrew far from him. So he's like, here, my seat is yours. And he put himself next to him. The chief got up, take his hands, performing a ceremony, kissing his hands, like here, and the king. Everybody lined up to kiss his hands. And then more than 500 Indian girls from 10 to 15 years old, seated on the outside of the window, began to sing, and other Indians to jump and wall. And the noble Indian men and women who were next to the chief sang. They said, as was later found out, that this was the greatest celebration, respect, and obedience that the chief
Had offered the adelantado because the brothers and sisters of the chief.
As the brothers and sisters of the chief danced, and his uncles and aunts, and there were Indian women among those nobles of 90 and 100 years who danced. Everyone showed that they were very happy and joyful. And then when they finished singing and dancing, then the Spanish music started, and Carlos said, oh, I really love it. Don't stop. And then he wouldn't stop playing everywhere he went. Then Carlos gave his sister as a wife and said, you got to go sleep with her now. And the governor said, oh, I'm a Christian. I can only sleep with Christians. He says, no, we're Christians now too. But then the chief said, then Menendez said, oh, but there's a lot of things to learn first, and you have to. And then the chief, he's persistent. He says, I've already found out the ways of yours. Then your music and your dishes, the law was better. I want to embrace it. And so they made, and all the people on the governor's side counseled him, it would really help read things along. And so, and he really didn't want to do it, but in the end he did. And it says, in the morning she woke up very happy, and the Christian woman that spoke with her said she was very content. So this is really only scratching the surface. If anybody has questions, maybe we have a minute or two to, thank you.
What do you think about yourself? Like, just all the typical standard yourself and household to read, but just
Okay, great question. You should get it from this book, Discovering Florida, edited and translated by John Worth, the professor in the University of West Florida in Pensacola. It has the translation.
do you know where I can find it without the translation?
I'll give it to you. It's here. The original. It's floating around the room. Yeah, you can take it with you. The original, but it's hard to read. It sort of looks like hieroglyphics. Here.
To read it with the print.
Okay, so that's called a transcription. So that's where it's. Yeah, I have that too. But the one that you should use, in my opinion, is this one, not the one that I had online, because the one that I had, that I found online before preparing for today, before coming across this particular book from the professor, the translation said that there was a distinction, that between the old and the young as to who could eat the sea wolves. But then this book says there's a distinction also between the principal and the lesser. And when you look at the original transcription, you could see it does use the word principis. And that wasn't mentioned in the one that I found for free online from Miguel Cervantes' online library, which is a source of archival material from Spain. But I'll give that to, I have it printed here. You have it now. Hey, somebody asking a question or just scratching your head?
I guess in Discovery, I was curious if there's an introductory book that captures some of the themes you covered.
What's that called?
No, I'm asking, is there a book that you would recommend?
I think this is the book, Discovering Florida, First Contact Narratives from Spanish Expeditions Along the Lower Gulf Coast. Because the Lower Gulf Coast was where they defeated Ponce de Leon twice. It's where Narvaez landed and everything fell apart. It's where De Soto landed and everything fell apart. It's where, so those were the original contacts were on the, these are narratives from people who were there. It was edited and translated by John Worth. And he also, being a scholar, he gives a lot of useful information in his introduction and in his preface.